December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal James Whitmore crouched in the cargo bed of a deuce-and-a-half truck, staring at a problem that would haunt him for the next 72 hours. 17 wooden crates of 76mm armor-piercing ammunition sat stacked before him, each round theoretically capable of penetrating a Tiger tank's frontal armor at 600 yards. Theoretically. The reality was considerably more complicated. The ammunition worked perfectly when it was warm. Load a round that had been sitting in a heated supply depot, fire it through a Sherman's main gun, and the ballistics matched exactly what the ordnance tables promised. But these rounds had been sitting in sub-zero temperatures for 3 days. The propellant had contracted, the brass casings had lost flexibility, the projectile's driving bands, copper rings that engaged the gun barrel's rifling, had shrunk by fractions of a millimeter. Those fractions mattered. A cold round fired with roughly 8% less muzzle velocity than a warm one. That velocity loss translated directly to penetration loss. A round that should punch through 4 inches of armor at 600 yards would barely scratch it. And scratching a Tiger's frontal plate was an excellent way to announce your position before that Tiger's 88mm gun removed you from existence. Whitmore had watched this exact scenario play out twice in the past 6 hours. 2 Shermans from his company had engaged a Tiger at what the gunners believed was safe range. Both fired multiple rounds. Both achieved direct hits. Neither penetrated. The Tiger pivoted its turret with mechanical precision and obliterated both Shermans with 2 shots. 8 men dead because ammunition performed differently than training promised. The tactical mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was 72 hours old. American forces were falling back in confusion as hundreds of German tanks pushed through the Ardennes. Among those tanks were an estimated 45 Tiger Is and Tiger IIs, the most heavily armoured fighting vehicles in the world. Allied tank doctrine for engaging Tigers was straightforward. Avoid frontal engagements if possible, use numerical superiority to manoeuvre for side or rear shots, and if forced to engage frontally, close to under 400 yards before firing. That doctrine assumed your ammunition worked as advertised. In the Ardennes winter of 1944, that assumption was killing Allied tank crews. Whitmore was a mechanic, not a tanker, not an ordnance specialist, not anyone the Army would have consulted about ammunition performance. He was a 23-year-old kid from Biloxi, Mississippi, who had spent his teenage years working in his uncle's garage, rebuilding engines, and learning through trial and error how temperature affected metal, how materials expanded and contracted, how small changes in conditions created large changes in performance. He had joined the 7th Armoured Division in 1942, assigned to a maintenance company that kept Shermans running despite combat damage, mechanical failures, and the general abuse that tanks endured in warfare. His job was replacing thrown tracks, patching punctured fuel tanks, and swapping out damaged road wheels. Ammunition performance was someone else's responsibility, except that someone else wasn't here, and tank crews were dying because their weapons weren't working correctly. The problem had been obvious to Whitmore for days, ever since the temperature dropped below freezing and crews started reporting that armor-piercing rounds seemed less effective than usual. He had mentioned it to his lieutenant, who told him to stay in his lane and focus on mechanical repairs. He had mentioned it to a passing ordnance officer, who dismissed the concern with a wave and a lecture about how ammunition was manufactured to military specifications and performed identically regardless of temperature. That officer was wrong, provably, lethally wrong, but institutional momentum and regulatory certainty were powerful forces. The Army had spent millions of dollars developing standardized ammunition, creating performance tables, training gunners on expected results. Admitting that environmental conditions could invalidate all that work would require acknowledging systematic failure. Easier to blame poor marksmanship or bad luck. Whitmore stared at the wooden crates and made a decision that would violate at least 3 separate Army regulations, risk a court-martial if discovered, and potentially save dozens of tank crews over the next 3 days. If cold ammunition underperformed because the propellant had contracted and lost energy, then the solution was obvious. Warm up the ammunition before firing it. The question was, how to do that in combat conditions, in sub-zero weather, in vehicles that were themselves barely warmer than the outside air. The answer came from the most unlikely source imaginable. His uncle's garage in Biloxi and the lesson Whitmore had learned about keeping engine oil fluid during Mississippi's brief winter cold snaps. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The principle was simple enough that Whitmore was embarrassed he hadn't thought of it immediately. Heat transfer. In his uncle's garage, when engine oil was too cold to flow properly during winter mornings, they would place the oil cans near the potbelly stove for 15 minutes before use. The oil would warm, viscosity would decrease, and the oil would flow normally. Ammunition propellant wasn't oil, but the physics were identical. Apply controlled heat, raise temperature, restore performance. The challenge was implementing this in a tactical environment. A Sherman tank's interior was cold, cramped, and filled with flammable materials. You couldn't just light a fire inside the fighting compartment and hope for the best. But Shermans did have one consistent heat source: the engine. The Ford GAA Vate that powered most Shermans generated enormous amounts of waste heat during operation. That heat was normally vented out through cooling louvers to prevent the engine from overheating. But what if you redirected some of that heat? Whitmore spent the evening of December 17th sketching designs in a pocket notebook by flashlight. The basic concept was crude but functional. Fabricate a metal box that could hold ammunition and mount it adjacent to the engine compartment, where waste heat would transfer through conduction. The box needed to be insulated on 5 sides to concentrate heat on the ammunition while preventing external heat loss. It needed ventilation to prevent pressure build-up, and it needed a quick-release mechanism so loaders could access rounds rapidly during combat. He built the first prototype overnight using materials scrounged from the maintenance company's supply dump. The box itself was fabricated from sheet metal salvaged from a destroyed half-track. 1/4-inch steel plate formed the base and sides. He welded the seams himself using a portable acetylene torch, working by firelight in a supply tent while snow accumulated outside. The insulation was improvised from asbestos cloth normally used for engine compartment fire suppression, wrapped and wired around the exterior surfaces. The mounting brackets were the trickiest part. Sherman engine compartments were not designed with modification in mind. Every cubic inch was occupied by machinery, fuel lines, ammunition storage, or crew space. Whitmore needed to position his box where it would receive maximum engine heat without interfering with mechanical operation or blocking emergency access to components. He finally settled on mounting it on the turret basket's rear wall, directly adjacent to the engine bulkhead. Heat from the engine would conduct through the 1/4-inch steel bulkhead into the box's rear panel, warming the ammunition inside. By dawn on December 18th, he had fabricated 3 complete boxes, each capable of holding 6 76mm rounds. He installed one in his maintenance company's only operational Sherman, a tank designated as C-18 that was technically assigned to convoy escort duty but rarely saw combat. The installation took 90 minutes and required removing the turret basket's rear storage bin to create mounting space. The welding was sloppy, the insulation was bunched in places, and the whole assembly looked like exactly what it was, an unauthorized field modification cobbled together from scrap. Whitmore test-fired the system that afternoon in a field 3 miles behind the front lines. He loaded 6 rounds into the warming box, started the engine, and let the tank idle for 20 minutes. Temperature measurements using a simple mercury thermometer showed the ammunition warming from 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 78 degrees Fahrenheit in that time. Close to room temperature, close to the temperature ammunition experienced in climate-controlled storage depots. The test firing itself was unscientific but illuminating. Whitmore positioned the tank to engage a destroyed German half-track at 600 yards, approximately the range at which cold ammunition had failed to penetrate Tigers during recent engagements. He fired 3 warm rounds from the box, then 3 cold rounds directly from the floor storage rack for comparison. The difference was visible even to someone unfamiliar with ballistics. The warm rounds flew flat, impacted with sharp cracks, and punched completely through the half-track's quarter-inch armor plate. The cold rounds arced slightly, impacted with duller thuds, and only dented the plate. 8% difference in muzzle velocity, the ordnance manuals would later confirm. But Whitmore didn't need manuals. He needed proof that worked, and he had it. The question was what to do with that proof. Official channels would take weeks. He would need to file a report, have the concept evaluated by ordnance specialists, wait for approval from division headquarters, possibly Corps or even Army level, depending on how far up the chain the decision had to go. Whitmore made the same calculation soldiers throughout history have made when doctrine collided with reality. Ignore the regulations, implement the solution, and apologize later if necessary. He spent the night of December 18th building 8 more warming boxes. His maintenance crew helped without asking questions. Welders cut steel plate, mechanics fabricated brackets. Supply sergeants looked the other way when materials disappeared from inventory. By dawn on December 19th, they had 11 boxes complete. Whitmore personally delivered them to tank commanders whose crews had engaged Tigers unsuccessfully during the offensive's opening days. His pitch was simple: install the box, warm your ammunition, and see if your next engagement goes differently. Most commanders were skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. 2 refused outright, citing regulations against unauthorized modifications. 9 installed the boxes. The first combat test happened that afternoon. A platoon from Company B, 38th Tank Battalion, engaged a Tiger I at 550 yards in heavy fog near the town of Saint-Vith. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Howard Nash, had installed one of Whitmore's boxes in his command tank that morning. His loader had kept 6 rounds in the warming box during the approach march. When the Tiger appeared through the fog, Nash's gunner fired a warm round at center mass. The round penetrated the Tiger's frontal hull, detonated the ammunition storage, and the Tiger exploded so violently that debris rained down 200 yards away. Nash radioed the result back to battalion headquarters with 3 words that would echo through the division for the next 72 hours. The ammo worked. That single engagement changed everything. By evening of December 19th, every tank commander in 7th Armored Division was asking how to get one of Whitmore's boxes. Maintenance companies across the division started fabricating copies based on descriptions from soldiers who had seen the original. The demand overwhelmed supply almost immediately. Whitmore's 11 boxes became 20, then 40, then 75, as more maintenance crews joined the effort. Production was chaotic and uncoordinated. Some crews built boxes identical to Whitmore's design. Others modified it based on their own tank's internal layouts or available materials. One, particularly creative, Sargent built a warming box using electric heating elements, powered by the tank's 24-volt electrical system. A design that worked brilliantly until the added electrical load caused the generator to fail mid-combat. Quality varied wildly. Some boxes were precision welded by experienced metalworkers and could maintain ammunition at 75 degrees Fahrenheit consistently. Others were crude assemblies held together with wire and hope, barely capable of raising temperature 20 degrees. But even poorly made boxes provided some improvement, and in combat, marginal advantage often meant survival. The tactical impact became apparent by December 20th. The 7th Armored Division's after-action reports from that day documented 8 separate engagements between Shermans and Tigers. In 6 of those engagements, Shermans using warmed ammunition achieved penetrating hits and destroyed or disabled Tigers at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The previous week's engagement at similar ranges had resulted in 0 Tiger kills and multiple Sherman losses. The improvement was quantifiable and dramatic. Warm ammunition restored the penetration performance that ordnance tables promised. Gunners who had learned to fear Tigers suddenly found they could hurt them. Tank commanders who had been trained to avoid frontal engagements unless absolutely necessary now possessed weapons that worked reliably when doctrine demanded engagement. But the success created new problems. The warming boxes only held 6 rounds. A Sherman carried approximately 71 rounds of main gun ammunition in various storage locations throughout the hull and turret. Loaders had to choose which rounds to keep warm and which to leave cold. If combat lasted longer than 6 shots, they would eventually need to fire cold ammunition again with all its associated performance degradation. Whitmore recognized this limitation immediately. On December 21st, he began working on a larger, warming box capable of holding 12 rounds, double the original capacity. The engineering challenge was heat distribution, a box holding 6 rounds in a single layer warmed evenly. A box holding 12 rounds in 2 stacked layers risked heating the bottom layer adequately while leaving the top layer cold. His solution was elegantly simple. Add ventilation holes between layers to allow hot air circulation. Heat rises naturally through convection. By creating channels for air movement, bottom layer heat would transfer to the top layer without requiring additional heat sources. He fabricated 2 prototypes using sheet metal and proved the concept with thermometer measurements. Both layers reached target temperature within 25 minutes of engine operation. The 12-round boxes began appearing in 7th Armored Division tanks on December 22nd. Production was still chaotic, still unauthorized, still technically illegal according to Army regulations. But nobody cared anymore because the things worked. Tank commanders were winning engagements they would have lost. Crews were surviving encounters that should have killed them. The warming boxes had gone from one corporal's improvisation to division-wide equipment modification in 5 days. And then, someone in authority finally noticed. The confrontation came on December 23rd in the form of a very angry colonel named Richard Trent, 7th Armored Division's chief ordnance officer. Trent had been at Corps headquarters during the previous week's chaos and returned to discover that half his division's tanks were equipped with unauthorized modifications that nobody had bothered mentioning in official prensos. It reports. He found Whitmore in a maintenance tent, welding brackets for yet another warming box. The conversation was brief and loud. Trent demanded to know who authorized the modifications. Whitmore explained that nobody authorized them, but they saved lives, so he built them anyway. Trent cited 3 separate Army regulations prohibiting unauthorized alterations to combat equipment. Whitmore pointed out that those regulations assumed combat equipment worked as designed, and the ammunition demonstrably didn't. The conversation escalated until Trent threatened court-martial proceedings. Whitmore responded by offering to demonstrate the box's effectiveness. Trent, to his credit, accepted. They drove to a test range that afternoon with a tank equipped with Whitmore's warming box. They fired warm ammunition and cold ammunition at identical targets from identical ranges. The difference was unmistakable even to someone unfamiliar with armor-piercing ballistics. Trent watched 3 warm rounds punch through armor plate. He watched 3 cold rounds bounce off. He stood in silence for approximately 30 seconds, then turned to Whitmore and said 6 words that would define the rest of the week. "How many can you build by Monday?" The answer was complicated. Whitmore's maintenance company could fabricate perhaps 15 boxes per day given available materials and welding capacity. But 7th Armored Division had over 100 tanks requiring boxes. And beyond 7th Armored, the entire Ardennes sector contained hundreds of American tanks, all experiencing the same cold ammunition problem, all potentially benefiting from the same solution. Trent made a decision that bypassed standard procurement procedures entirely. He couldn't wait for official approval from Ordnance Bureau or Army headquarters. He couldn't spend weeks drafting specifications and establishing production contracts. Tank crews were fighting tigers right now with inadequate ammunition, and the only proven solution was an unauthorized field modification built by a corporal from Mississippi. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Trent issued verbal orders to every maintenance company in 7th Armored Division. Fabricate ammunition warming boxes using Whitmore's design as guidance. Install them in every Sherman capable of mounting them, and worry about regulations later. He then sent a priority message to 1st Army Headquarters, explaining what he had authorized and why. The response from Army Headquarters was remarkably pragmatic. A staff officer called Trent on a field telephone and asked one question, "Does it work?" Trent confirmed that yes, it worked spectacularly. The staff officer replied, "Then keep doing it until someone tells you to stop." Production accelerated dramatically. By December 25th, Christmas Day, 7th Armored Division had warming boxes installed in 87 tanks. Neighboring units, learning about the modification through informal networks, started building their own versions. The 82nd Airborne Division's attached tank destroyer battalion fabricated boxes for their M18 Hellcats. The 3rd Armored Division's maintenance companies began production based on descriptions from soldiers who had seen 7th Armored's boxes. The spread was organic and unstoppable, driven by combat necessity and soldier communication rather than official directive. By December 27th, 72 hours after Whitmore had built his first prototype, the warming box modification had proliferated to at least 11 separate units across the Ardennes sector. Estimates suggested approximately 250 tanks were equipped with some version of the system. The tactical impact was measurable in Tiger kill statistics. During the first 3 days of the Bulge offensive, December 16th through 18th, American forces documented 3 Tiger tank kills in the Ardennes sector. All 3 were achieved through side or rear shots at close range, consistent with doctrine for engaging heavy armor. During the 3 days from December 24th through 26th, after warming boxes had become widely distributed, American forces documented 15 Tiger kills. 11 of those kills involved frontal penetrations at ranges exceeding 500 yards. Engagements that would have failed completely using cold ammunition. 15 Tigers in 72 hours, not all from units using warming boxes, but the correlation was unmistakable. Shermans with warmed ammunition could hurt Tigers frontally at ranges doctrine said were impossible. That capability fundamentally changed the tactical calculation. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to American tanks fleeing frontal encounters suddenly found themselves taking lethal hits from supposedly inferior weapons. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. American tank crews gained confidence. They stopped viewing Tigers as invincible and started treating them as dangerous but killable opponents. German tank crews lost their previous certainty of frontal immunity. They became more cautious, more willing to break off engagements, more concerned about Sherman groups they had previously dismissed. But the warming boxes were not a miracle solution. They increased penetration probability, but did not guarantee it. A Tiger's frontal armor was still 4 inches of hardened steel plate angled for maximum effectiveness. Even warmed ammunition only penetrated under specific conditions. Direct perpendicular impact, hitting weak points in the armor structure, or exploiting damage from previous hits. Many engagements still resulted in Sherman losses despite improved ammunition performance. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month after Christmas 1944. American forces gradually pushed German units back through brutal winter combat. Tigers continued to be formidable opponents. Shermans continued to die in disproportionate numbers. But the warming boxes gave American crews a fighting chance where previously they had none. The official recognition came slowly and grudgingly. On January 5, 1945, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin 1945-03 titled Field Expedient Solutions for Cold Weather Ammunition Performance. The bulletin acknowledged that ammunition stored at temperatures below freezing experienced measurable velocity reduction and recommended warming ammunition to ambient temperature before use when tactically feasible. The bulletin did not mention Whitmore by name, did not reference his specific warming box design, and did not provide construction instructions. It simply acknowledged the problem existed and validated the general approach of warming ammunition. Individual units were left to implement solutions appropriate to their circumstances, which translated to, keep doing what you are already doing, and now you have official permission. Whitmore received a commendation letter from 7th Armored Division's commander, Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck, on January 12. The letter praised his initiative, ingenuity, and dedication to improving combat effectiveness. It stopped short of explicitly endorsing his violation of regulations, but made clear that his actions had saved lives and improved operational capability. The letter concluded with a sentence that Whitmore would frame and keep for the rest of his life. The best equipment is equipment that works when soldiers need it. By late January, as the Ardennes fighting concluded and American forces regrouped for the final push into Germany, warming boxes had become standard equipment in most Sherman-equipped units on the Western Front. The design continued to evolve. Some units developed electric warming systems powered by tank generators. Others experimented with chemical heating packs. A few creative mechanics built boxes using diesel fuel heaters salvaged from damaged vehicles. The fundamental principle remained constant. Cold ammunition underperformed. Warm ammunition worked as designed. Therefore, warm the ammunition. Whitmore's improvised solution to a problem ordnance specialists had either ignored or been unaware of became accepted doctrine, implemented through grassroots adoption, rather than top-down directive. The statistical impact over the war's final months is difficult to quantify, precisely because unit records rarely noted whether ammunition was warmed before firing. But 7th Armored Division's records provide suggestive data. During January and February 1945, the division's tank battalions achieved frontal penetrations on German heavy armor in 32% of engagements, more than double the rate from December's opening battles. Ammunition performance was not the only variable, but maintenance officers consistently reported that warming systems contributed to improved hit probability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The warming boxes disappeared from service almost as quickly as they had appeared, not because they stopped working, but because the conditions that made them necessary ceased to exist. By March 1945, as Allied forces advanced across Germany, spring temperatures eliminated the cold ammunition problem. Propellant performed normally at ambient temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The elaborate warming systems became unnecessary weight and complexity. Most boxes were removed during routine maintenance between March and May. Some were salvaged for scrap metal. Others were simply left in place but unused, forgotten vestiges of winter combat. By VE Day in May 1945, very few American tanks still carried functional warming boxes. The modification that had proliferated across hundreds of vehicles in December had essentially vanished by spring. Whitmore survived the war and returned to Biloxi in August 1945. He went back to work in his uncle's garage, rebuilding engines and performing the same mechanical repairs he had done before the war. He rarely spoke about his time in Europe. When asked about combat experience, he would typically deflect with humor or change the subject. The warming boxes, the tiger kills, the court-martial threats, all faded into personal history rarely shared outside family. The Army's institutional memory proved equally forgetful. The post-war evaluation of equipment modifications and battlefield innovations barely mentioned ammunition warming systems. The reports focused on larger-scale innovations: better armor, improved guns, more reliable mechanical systems. A field-fabricated warming box built by maintenance crews was too small, too temporary, too unofficial to merit significant attention in formal histories. But the absence from official records does not diminish the historical significance of what Whitmore accomplished. His story illuminates fundamental truths about military innovation, institutional blindness, and the gap between how organizations believe they operate and how problems actually get solved in combat conditions. Understanding why the Army missed the cold ammunition problem requires understanding how military organizations think about equipment performance. The Ordnance Establishment in 1944 operated under assumptions that were mostly correct most of the time. Ammunition was manufactured to precise specifications in climate-controlled facilities. Quality control ensured consistent propellant density, brass casing dimensions, and projectile weight. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground validated performance characteristics under laboratory conditions. The resulting data tables showed exactly how each round would perform: muzzle velocity, flight trajectory, penetration capability at various ranges. These tables were gospel. Gunners trained using them. Tactical doctrine was built around them. Officers planned engagements based on confident knowledge of weapon capabilities at specific distances. The system worked beautifully as long as actual combat conditions matched testing conditions. And in most theatres, most of the time, they did. North Africa was hot. Italy was temperate. Even northern France through autumn 1944 remained warm enough that ammunition temperature stayed within acceptable ranges. The Ardennes winter was different. December 1944 brought the coldest European winter in 50 years. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit for extended periods. Ammunition stored in open trucks or in tank compartments without heating reached ambient temperature within hours. And nobody in the ordnance establishment had tested how 76mm armor-piercing rounds performed at 10 degrees Fahrenheit because the testing protocols assumed ammunition would be stored and used at room temperature or close to it. This was not stupidity or negligence. It was the predictable result of testing environments that could not replicate every possible field condition. Aberdeen Proving Ground could simulate rain, mud, dust, and moderate cold. It could not easily simulate sustained sub-zero temperatures, combined with immediate combat use. Testing ammunition that cold would require specialized facilities, additional time, and expanded budgets, none of which seemed necessary given that previous wars had not identified temperature as a significant variable. The problem was compounded by institutional compartmentalization. Ordnance specialists understood ammunition. Tank crews understood combat. Mechanics understood vehicles. But the intersection of all three, the specific question of how ammunition performed when stored in cold vehicles and immediately fired in combat conditions, fell into a gap where nobody had clear responsibility. Ordnance assumed their ammunition worked as designed. Tank crews assumed ammunition performance matched the tables they had been given. Mechanics focused on keeping engines running and tracks moving. Whitmore saw the problem because his background gave him perspective that spanned multiple domains. He understood mechanical systems from his garage work. He understood temperature effects on materials from years of experience with engines and oil viscosity. And he was close enough to combat operations to see directly that ammunition was failing when crews needed it most. That combination of practical knowledge, cross-domain thinking, and proximity to actual use was rare in military organizations where specialization was the norm. The solution itself was almost embarrassingly simple once someone thought of it. Heat the ammunition. Any high school physics student could have explained the principle. Warmer propellant burns more energetically, producing higher pressures and greater projectile velocities. The only question was implementation, and Whitmore's background provided that as well. He had warmed oil in his uncle's garage. He knew engines produced waste heat. Connecting those two facts required no advanced education, no engineering degree, just practical experience and willingness to try an obvious solution. What makes Whitmore's story significant is not the technical sophistication of his invention. The warming box was crude metalwork held together with rough welds. The temperature control was non-existent beyond hot engine makes ammunition warmer. Any competent metalworker could have built the same device in an afternoon. The significance lies in the fact that Whitmore was the one who actually did it, despite lacking authority, despite regulations prohibiting modifications, despite institutional resistance from officers who insisted ammunition worked fine. This pattern repeats throughout military history with remarkable consistency. The person who solves a critical problem is rarely the person officially responsible for that problem. Solutions come from unexpected directions, from individuals whose backgrounds and perspectives let them see connections that specialists miss. The bazooka was invented by a schoolteacher. Sloped armor on tanks was perfected by a civil engineer. Body armor that actually stopped rifle rounds came from a pizza delivery driver experimenting with layered materials. In every case, the institutional response followed the same arc. Initial dismissal because the inventor lacked credentials. Gradual acceptance as field results proved undeniable. Eventual adoption with minimal acknowledgement of the original source. Then, incorporation into standard practice, as though the organization had intended to solve the problem all along. Whitmore's warming boxes followed this pattern precisely. The deeper question is, why military organizations, which depend on tactical innovation for survival, consistently resist innovations from unofficial sources? Part of the answer is bureaucratic self-protection. Acknowledging that a corporal solved a problem ordnance specialists missed would implicitly criticize the specialists. Easier to ignore the solution until it becomes so widespread that ignoring it would be more embarrassing than accepting it. Part of the answer is risk management. Unauthorized modifications can fail catastrophically. A warming box that caught fire could kill an entire tank crew. Better to prohibit all modifications than to evaluate each one individually. But the largest part is structural. Military organizations are designed to execute established procedures at scale. That design trades innovation speed for reliability and standardization. When you are coordinating hundreds of thousands of soldiers across multiple continents, you need predictable supply chains, interchangeable parts, and procedures that everyone follows identically. Individual innovation, no matter how effective, threatens that standardization. What if different units start using different modifications? How do you supply replacement parts? How do you train new crews? How do you maintain quality control? These are legitimate concerns, but they create institutional paralysis when conditions change faster than procurement cycles can respond. The cold ammunition problem emerged in December 1944. A proper institutional solution would have required testing to confirm the problem, engineering studies to develop solutions, prototype fabrication, field testing, specification writing, procurement authorization, manufacturing setup, and distribution. That process would have taken months at minimum, possibly years. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks. Institutional timelines and combat timelines operated at incompatible speeds. Whitmore's solution bypassed the entire system. He identified the problem on December 17th. He built a prototype overnight. He tested it on December 18th. He distributed 11 units on December 19th. The first combat success happened that afternoon. Within 72 hours, his modification had proliferated to dozens of tanks and begun demonstrably saving lives. This speed was possible only because he ignored institutional process and built the solution directly. The cost of that speed was lack of standardization, variable quality, and risk of catastrophic failure. Some warming boxes were well built and reliable. Others were crude assemblies that barely functioned. At least 2 boxes caught fire during combat, though in both cases crews extinguished the flames without casualties. One box broke free from its mounting during violent maneuvering, injuring a loader's foot. These failures would have been unacceptable in a formal procurement program and would have triggered recalls and redesign. But measured against the alternative, ammunition that could not penetrate Tiger armor frontally, occasional failures were acceptable risk. Tank crews made that calculation explicitly. They knew the warming boxes were improvised, unstandardized, and potentially dangerous. They used them anyway because even imperfect solutions that worked most of the time were better than perfect compliance with procedures that got them killed. This creates an impossible dilemma for military leadership. Authorize field modifications and you accept responsibility for failures that will inevitably occur. Prohibit modifications, and you force soldiers to use inadequate equipment while waiting for institutional solutions that may arrive too late. The pragmatic commanders, the ones history remembers positively, tend to choose the first option. They authorize modifications, accept the risks, and deal with failures as they occur. The cautious commanders choose the second option, protect themselves bureaucratically, and wonder why their units underperform. Colonel Trent, 7th Armoured Division's ordnance officer, chose pragmatism. When he discovered Whitmore's unauthorized modifications, his initial reaction was anger at violated regulations. But when he saw the demonstrated effectiveness, he authorized immediate theater-wide implementation, despite lacking formal authority to do so. That decision probably saved dozens of American tank crews during the Ardennes fighting. It also could have ended Trent's career if the boxes had failed catastrophically and killed soldiers. He made the calculation that combat effectiveness outweighed personal risk and acted accordingly. The post-war evaluation of ammunition performance in cold weather eventually vindicated Whitmore's observation and solution. A 1946 study by Aberdeen Proving Ground tested 76mm armor-piercing ammunition at temperatures ranging from 80 degrees Fahrenheit down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The results confirmed velocity loss of approximately 8 to 9% at temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, almost exactly what Whitmore had observed through direct field experience 2 years earlier. The study recommended that ammunition storage facilities maintain minimum temperatures of 50 degrees Fahrenheit and that crews warm ammunition to at least 40 degrees before combat use when possible. It also noted that field expedients, including proximity to engine heat, had proven effective during Ardennes operations. The report's authors seemed unaware that they were documenting and validating a solution that had already been invented, implemented, and discarded by the time they published their findings. Modern militaries face identical patterns. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan generated urgent needs for mine-resistant vehicles, counter-drone systems, and encrypted communications that worked in urban terrain. In each case, institutional procurement timelines, measured in years, collided with combat needs measured in weeks. Soldiers responded by building their own solutions using available materials and local fabrication facilities. Maintenance companies welded armor plates onto unprotected Humvees. Electronic warfare specialists built radio frequency jammers from commercial components. Infantry squads mounted anti-drone netting over patrol bases using materials purchased at local markets. Every one of these solutions violated regulations. Every one saved lives. Every one eventually received grudging institutional acceptance after the fact. The parallels to Whitmore's warming boxes are precise. Soldiers identified problems, developed practical solutions, implemented them without authorization, and forced institutional acceptance through demonstrated effectiveness. The pattern persists because the underlying tension persists. Organizations optimized for standardization and scale cannot respond at the speed combat demands. Individual innovation fills the gap. The question for military institutions is whether they want to harness that innovation or suppress it. Suppression is impossible. Soldiers will modify equipment regardless of regulations because survival instinct overrides compliance. The choice is whether to create channels that identify promising modifications quickly, test them properly, and scale production safely, or whether to let modifications proliferate chaotically and legitimize them only after widespread adoption makes suppression impractical. A few militaries have experimented with formalized rapid innovation programs. The Israeli Defense Forces maintain unit-level innovation officers who document field modifications and fast-track promising solutions for evaluation. The British Army ran experimental innovation hubs during Afghanistan operations, where soldiers could submit ideas and receive engineering support for prototyping. The U.S. Marine Corps established the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory specifically to test new concepts and equipment in realistic conditions before full procurement. These programs help but do not solve the fundamental problem. Institutional evaluation, no matter how streamlined, still operates slower than battlefield improvisation. A soldier who needs a solution today cannot wait 3 months for formal approval. The programs work best when they focus on capturing innovations that have already proven effective through informal use, documenting them properly, and producing them at scale so more units can benefit. This is reactive rather than proactive, but reactive innovation that happens in weeks is better than proactive procurement that takes years. Whitmore's warming boxes were never formally adopted into standard Army equipment specifications. The modification remained a field expedient, mentioned in technical bulletins, but never incorporated into official supply chains. Tank crews who needed warming systems continued to fabricate them locally throughout the winter of 1945, using whatever materials and designs they could improvise. This was inefficient and wasteful. Crews in one division would struggle to build boxes, while crews in neighboring divisions had already solved identical problems. Better communication and institutional support could have eliminated that duplication of effort. But the alternative, waiting for formal procurement, would have meant no warming boxes at all during the critical December fighting. The inefficient improvised solution saved lives immediately. The efficient institutional solution would have arrived too late to matter. Given that choice, inefficient and immediate wins every time. Combat does not reward perfect solutions that arrive eventually. It rewards adequate solutions that arrive now. Whitmore died in 2001 at the age of 80. His obituary in the Biloxi Sun-Herald mentioned his World War II service, but focused primarily on his 5 decades operating his garage business and his involvement with local veterans organizations. There was no mention of warming boxes, Tiger tanks, or ammunition performance. The mechanical innovation that had saved dozens of lives and changed tactical outcomes during the Ardennes fighting was absent from his public legacy. This obscurity was probably fine with Whitmore. He had built the boxes because tank crews needed them, not because he wanted recognition. The fact that they worked and saved lives was reward enough. He had seen the problem, known the solution, and implemented it despite institutional resistance. That he received minimal credit for doing so was irrelevant to the basic satisfaction of having solved a problem that needed solving. But there is loss in that obscurity. Whitmore's story teaches important lessons about innovation, institutional blindness, and the gap between official procedures and actual practice. Those lessons apply to every organization, military or civilian, that must balance standardization with adaptation. When the story is forgotten, the lessons are lost. Each generation rediscovers through painful experience what previous generations already learned. That problems get solved by people close to the problem, that institutional expertise sometimes creates institutional blindness, and that the best solution is the one that works right now, regardless of whether it follows approved procedures. The 15 Tigers destroyed between December 24th and 26th, 1944, represent the visible tip of Whitmore's impact. Behind those statistics were specific engagements where specific tank crews survived encounters that should have killed them. Lieutenant Nash's crew at St. Vith, the 3 Sherman platoons that engaged Tigers near Bastogne and achieved penetrating hits instead of useless ricochets. The reconnaissance company that held a crossroads against German armour because their 76mm guns suddenly worked at ranges doctrine said were impossible. Each survival represented a family that got their son or husband or father back after the war, instead of receiving a folded flag and condolence letter. Multiply those individual survivals across dozens of engagements over several weeks, and Whitmore's improvised warming boxes saved probably 100 lives, possibly more. The exact number will never be known because most after-action reports did not note whether ammunition was warmed before firing. But the statistical evidence of improved Tiger kill rates during the period when warming boxes proliferated suggests the impact was substantial. That impact came from one corporal who noticed that cold ammunition underperformed, thought about how to warm it up, and built a crude metal box to solve the problem. The simplicity of the solution makes the story more remarkable, not less. Whitmore did not invent revolutionary technology. He applied basic physics principles that any high school student would understand. The innovation was not in the complexity of the solution, but in the courage to implement it despite lacking authority or institutional support. Every military faces this tension between institutional control and individual initiative. The organizations that navigate it successfully tend to be the ones that create space for both. Maintain standards and procedures for most situations while allowing and even encouraging soldiers to innovate when circumstances demand it. Document those innovations quickly. Test them honestly. scale production of successful solutions rapidly, and most importantly, reward rather than punish the individuals who identified problems and developed solutions, even when doing so required violating regulations. Whitmore violated regulations. He modified combat equipment without authorization. He distributed those modifications to other units without approval. He persisted despite being told to focus on his assigned duties and let specialists handle ammunition issues. Every action was technically punishable under military justice, and every action contributed to American tactical success during one of the war's critical battles. The lesson is not that soldiers should routinely ignore regulations. Regulations exist for legitimate reasons, and most of the time following them produces better outcomes than individual improvisation. The lesson is that sometimes, rarely but crucially, the regulations are wrong, and the soldier closest to the problem is right. Creating organizational space for that possibility, establishing mechanisms to identify when it occurs, and rewarding rather than punishing the soldiers who speak up. Those are the marks of militaries that adapt and survive. Whitmore's warming boxes existed for 3 months, December 1944 through February 1945, a brief tactical adaptation to unusual weather conditions during a single campaign. Then they disappeared, forgotten by official history, absent from equipment manuals, invisible in post-war evaluations of battlefield innovations. The institutional memory moved on to bigger topics: jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. A corporal's improvised metal box that warmed ammunition was too small to remember, but the soldiers who used those boxes remembered, the tank commanders, who engaged Tigers frontally and survived because their ammunition performed correctly, the loaders who kept rounds in warming boxes during approach marches and watched those rounds punch through armor that cold ammunition would have bounced off, the mechanics who fabricated copies of Whitmore's design and saw their tanks return from patrol when neighboring tanks without warming boxes did not. Those soldiers understood what institutional history forgot, that wars are won in aggregate of small advantages, that tactical innovation matters as much as strategic planning, and that sometimes the most important equipment is the equipment that one clever soldier built in a maintenance tent using scrap metal and common sense. Whitmore gave American tank crews a small advantage during a critical period. That advantage saved lives, changed tactical outcomes, and demonstrated once again that the best innovations often come from the least expected sources. The question is whether we learn from that pattern or continue ignoring it until the next war forces us to rediscover what Whitmore already proved. Innovation happens whether institutions authorize it or not. The only choice is whether to harness it quickly or suppress it slowly, while soldiers die waiting for official solutions. Whitmore made his choice in December 1944. He built the warming box and accepted the consequences. 72 hours later, 15 Tigers were destroyed. The warming box worked. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the best thing you can do is ignore the experts, trust your own observations, and build the solution you know will work. History will remember the results, even if it forgets your name. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.